Everyone, welcome to Chasey Partners webinar. My name is Sarah Yee. I'm head of marketing for Chasey Partners. Just a couple of logistic announcements before we dive in. So, first of all, please note the webinar is in listen-only mode. But if you would like to get involved in discussions, please do let us know, and we will give you the option to unmute yourself. And secondly, we will leave a few minutes at the end of the webinar for Q&A, but please feel free to submit your question via the Q&A box anytime during the webinar, and we'll try to get them answered. Lastly, we will be having a few live polling questions throughout the webinar, which require your mobile phone to scan a QR code. So all you need to do is take out your phone and put them in the picture mode, like if you were going to take a picture, and scan the QR code on the screen, and that you will see the option popping up for you to vote. We will repeat that when it comes to the first polling. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the webinar to our speakers. Phil, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome everyone. Welcome to this Chasey Partners webinar on the next generation shared services. Basically, in summary, the focus of the webinar today is to discuss what's happening in next generation shared services, specifically post-COVID, both as a response to what organizations have been doing in response to COVID and what's going to continue as a result of that response and digitalization and changes in the ways of working, hyperautomation, operating models. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different subjects today. But before we get into the meat of it, as Sarah said, I'll be your chair today, hosting the session. I'm the CEO of Chasey Partners. My name is Phil Searle. Prior to Chasey, I ran global shared service organizations. I was a former corporate controller, former CFO. We established Chasey back in 2006, so about 15 years. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. But with that, I'm going to introduce my colleagues today, including, I'm very delighted to say, Paul Bartley, who's a friend, former client. I've known Paul for many years. He doesn't work for Chasey. He's a special guest today, and he will introduce himself in a second. But first up, Emer, go ahead.
Good day, everybody. So my name is Emer O'Kelly. I'm the Regional Director for Europe for Chasey. Ex-FD is CFO in a previous life, but I've been working in transformation one way or the other for the last 12, actually closer than 15 years now. That's me.
Chewy?
I'll hand over to Chewy.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Emer. This is Chewy Michel. I'm the Global Head of Hyperautomation for Chasey Partners. Prior to that, I was the Head of Shared Services for 3 years, where I ran a number of automation programs, and happy to be here. Paul?
Thanks, Chewy. And thanks, Phil. Thanks, Chasey Partners, for having me on today. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate and give some thoughts. As Phil said, I'm Paul Bartley. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for GBS at Odfjell Drilling Philippines. And I've spent the last 3 years designing and implementing a GBS model for the group and setting up a shared services center in Manila, Philippines. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Paul. Actually, I first met Paul, God, it must be about 9 or 10 years ago, I guess. It must be, but firstly at conferences, actually. So we met at conferences, which is the case with so many of the people I know. We know each other, and then Paul was the director of shared services, the program support center for the federal government, and we worked together there. So thanks again for joining today, Paul. Okay, Sarah, next slide, please. Let's get into the. So what are we talking about today? Well, introduction we talked about. The main focus today is to talk about, as I said, next generation shared services. What's going on? And so we'll be talking about the top trends. Emer will be talking through the top trends. He'll also be talking about the future of work. And the impact of the way work gets done on teams and frameworks and structures. Then we'll be talking, Chewy will be talking about hyperautomation and digital. And then I'll touch a little bit on driving a transformed shared service operating model. So the focus really is around trends, the way the work gets done, the latest in digital and operating model. And I would say, I got asked this question yesterday, I would say that there are 3 main drivers from an operating model perspective. And actually you heard Paul already mention one, global business services, which is one that's been around, but it's continued for years, but really is developing now. The second is the one office model you may have heard about. So that we talk a little bit about that. And the third is digital. So those are three main topic trends, and we'll be talking about those. In terms of Chasey, if you just go back a slide. So in terms of Chasey Partners, I mentioned founded 15 years ago. We have three main service lines, what we call the shared services, which we've been in as an organization 15 years. I've personally been involved in the shared services and global business services for about 25 years now, which is a bit scary even as I say that. And the first conference I spoke at was in 1998, which is sort of crazy too, because that's like the last millennia. But anyway, and the second area is business transformation, which is broader transformation of operating models, and actually links more to the sort of one office and the latest in digital technologies, but we also do business continuity. And then we have a specific stream on hyperautomation and robotic process automation, which is the stream that Chewy leads. The focus today, and we have Emer on today because of, as he mentioned, he's a regional director for Europe. So that's why this particular session today is mainly focused on European time zone. So with that, next slide, please, Sarah. So these are just a splash of our clients on a page. Hopefully you recognize many of the names on here. So we deal with sort of mid to multinational size organizations. We help them transform operating models, implement shared services, implement new technologies. And on the right-hand side, you see some of our specific robotic process automation, intelligent automation clients, where we've actually delivered solutions for them in that space. I would add, before I move on and hand over to Emer, that we don't do any assignment today, any of our global business services, shared service engagements, where we don't talk about hyperautomation and RPA. And I was actually, again, talking to somebody yesterday, the integration and linkage between delivery model, digitalization, hyperautomation, and the whole integration of service delivery from front, middle, and back office is one of the real trends over the last few years, partly accelerated by the pandemic, but was what was happening in any case. So we don't do any engagement without talking about the latest in hyperautomation, and Chewy will be talking about that, and I'll refer to it later. So with that, I'm going to stop talking for a second, and I will hand over to Emer, who's going to start covering the latest trends in shared services. So Emer.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So a couple of slides here about trends. We will be asking you to fill in a polling question at the end of this little section, so be ready for that. So looking at trends, going across there, we'll look at the traditional shared services, the focusing on centralization, usually in a single location or limited locations, looking at non-core processes, but while maintaining a client focus. So the things that we're looking for traditionally there would be the economies of scale, standardization of processes, a better control environment, and getting labor arbitrage usually to justify the business case. We're looking at taking out both transactional and professional or technical activities where possible. These may be mission critical. We're also looking at common services and at the same time developing a level of specialization. In terms of maintaining the best of client focus, we always spend a lot of time talking about the service partnership agreement, not the service level agreement, the service partnership, a two-way arrangement between the clients and the shared service operation, which of course requires a good level of performance measurement. It needs to focus on continuous improvement, to differentiate from BPO, for example, and it needs to be commercially driven. So that's pretty traditional stuff. But thinking about COVID-19, where we've been for the last year and a quarter, we've called out three things really that are flagging up there. One is resilience. An awful lot of people are working from home. A lot of people may continue to work from home. If there was a business continuity plan, it has been tested in the last 15 months. Thankfully, well, hopefully there has been one. Otherwise, there was a bit of scrambling that was done in that period. Selective outsourcing, as opposed to less focused outsourcing, is certainly something that's part of maintaining the resilience, and also dealing with knowledge management. So with more people working remotely, it's not as easy to just share, to turn around the corner and ask somebody else for advice. Managing the knowledge that the operations have is a critical thing. And the more remote you are, the more important that is to maintaining resilience. So then, digitalization, Okay, we're talking about automation here, but we've got a section later on where Chewy will talk about that in more detail. It is something that's high on the list. Phil mentioned it earlier that we don't really have any discussions now that don't involve RPA somewhere along the line. Cloud platforms versus legacy or in-house systems. The cloud platforms have actually made quite a leap forward in the recent past, driven by the circumstances. Virtualization has been a necessity with people not physically being able to stay in to make contact, to sit down, chat, etc. So virtualization has become really important. And the collaboration and the communication tools are used. Everybody now probably has 3 different versions of collaboration and communication tools that they use on a regular basis. We're doing it right now. Lastly, the one office concept. Sarah mentioned that this really is just focused on looking at true end-to-end processes, breaking down any barriers there were between front office and middle office and back office. We really need to focus on things end-to-end, and build performance management into how that is done, and of course out of that get a level of data and analytics that you can trust, that you can rely on, and that you can use to manage your business and depend on it. So there's some of the trends. If we move on to the next slide, these are some of the trends that we Chasey partners are calling out. We're seeing automation and digitalization. We're seeing the one office concept, people moving towards the full end-to-end approach to how to do business. Future of work, that's where we're going today. So people have to rethink locations, rethink the model, consider hybrid models. There is a trend towards coming closer to nearshore or onshore. The far shoring or the cheap shoring perhaps is becoming less prevalent. And there is still continuing business process outsourcing, but well, at least for our part, we're seeing more of that coming towards the captive end of the market. That's just the trend we're seeing. Okay, so agility, resilience. I mentioned resilience on the last slide, but agility, the ability to react, to deal with things as they change, to deal with shocks, to deal with shutdowns, and continue, the continuous support for the business, while maintaining the end-to-end ability of processes. So next generation, where do we think it's going? Talent optimization and data analytics, I mentioned earlier. Data analytics particularly, getting that set up so it can be relied on. Also, that turns particularly the finance area more towards being a strategic advisor, and pushing towards a wider, deeper level of services in a global business services model. Last thing on this page before we get to the poll, and get ready with your phones to do a poll. So performance, we're looking at the operating model again. We mentioned data. It's got to be real time. It's got to be trusted. It's got to be, something that is dependable. Service levels have got to stay consistent, and to support that, we usually talk about a client interaction framework, or CIF, which has the key components to make the service identifiable, real, measurable, agreed, and fixable if something goes awry. So these are the trends we're seeing, and after this, I think we're ready for the first poll. And what we're asking you here, so the QR code will appear in a second. A single word about what the COVID-19 and so on means for you, and you'll see it popping up on the screen. I'll give you a minute or two, and then we'll go from there. Okay, I think the very clear from this that there's one word, one really big word in here: remote. Okay, it doesn't matter how many people click on it. Click on. Thanks for your inputs, but we're seeing that remote here is the big factor that's coming out of this. So, Paul, if I could, what do you think will be the most important change in your shared services organization or your GBS organization post-COVID, and how does remote figure in it?
Well, Emer, I bet you that most of the people on this call have spent large parts of their careers trying to talk people into the fact we can do things remote, right? We're all about moving work to centers and doing work offshore and doing work away from the business, away from the legacy locations. Well, we've had a whole year now, and I think we've got a lot more people in the choir, right? I think it's a little ridiculous to argue that a lot of things that we never thought could be done remotely can be done remotely. And what that means to me is it can also be done somewhere else. If it can be done across town, it can be done across the globe. And that question has to be asked. So I think the biggest impact on GBS is going to be a growth in the amount of work that we're asked to do. And the challenge is going to be, are we ready for that? Are we innovative enough? Are we seen as the people that are the transformers? Or are we just the back office? And that's going to be the biggest challenge, but I think it's also going to have the most impact. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of conversations. I've talked to a lot of my peers about, when are you going back? How much are you going back? Are you going back at all into the office? And everybody's got their plan. And I think that's going to shake out over the next year or so. But the long-term lasting impact is going to be a bigger move, an opportunity for us to take more, I think.
Okay, so we're talking about the future of work, and the changing parameters. So let's look at a couple of things we need to consider. And we're looking at workforce, workplace. Okay, so remote working, that was the remote was the biggest word we had on that last section. So I think there's going to be an expectation there's going to be a lot of it in the future. The model will become more hybrid, a mix remote and others. Virtual is going to be getting more and more required, but also accepted and taken as the standard. Travel is likely to reduce significantly. Just from myself, my travel has dropped dramatically. More than 90%. And even looking into the next 6-12 months, it probably won't come back to more than a third or 40% of what it was before. So that's going to go down. Digitalization, we have mentioned getting everything digitalized so it's usable, trackable, etc. And that's going to require some redesigning of the processes as we go along. So that's what we think on the work side. On the workforce, are we transforming the workforce? Are we looking for a wider talent pool, deeper? What are we looking for there? Virtual onboarding. I've spoken with people who've actually said that virtual onboarding can be as good or better than physical onboarding. Not what I expected, but that's what I'm hearing. We got to consider all of this in our overall talent strategy, leading to what is the leadership, what's required of leadership now, what are the changes, what are the nuances that are going to be required there. Oops, hold on. Thank you. And then performance. How are we going to measure the performance? How do we measure performance when we don't see people for a lot of the time, when we don't see them outside of formal settings, for example? That's going to be a bit of a challenge, and there's going to be a bit of a culture shift there, and to some extent a trust shift. I mean, we have come across cases of people wanting to exercise greater control over their teams with a small t, that is, and that becomes more difficult in some people's minds when they can't go out, reach them, and touch them. So there is a culture shift required there. Then looking at the workplace itself, what is going to change? Are we looking at physical space? Are we changing that? What impact does that have on regulations? If we got people working at home, is there going to be some regulatory impact from that? Safety, we can control safety with facilities management, etc. We can't control it if we're not in physical control of the workplace. Same could be said about security. Okay, there's going to be equipment that's going to be around the place, but there's other security issues because of a distributed workforce. So physical facilities, and we're going to come back to this in a second. Physical facilities, what's that going to mean for that? Do we need as much? And I think in a couple of pages, Paul, I'll be back to you to ask about that from your perspective particularly, and potentially sharing space, pre-sharing space. Accepting that there will be sharing of space ad infinitum. So if we could just go down to the next page. So we had traditional, we've added remote, and we've really added virtual. So in terms of the definition of this, traditional, we just have team members physically located in one place. Yeah, that's it. With remote, we have we take that to a different level, but not all the members are geographically located, but they are still attached, generally still attached to a single physical location or a group of physical locations. Whereas when we go to virtual, the team is everywhere. They're not linked to a physical location. They could be anywhere. They could be in any country. They could be in any location within a country.
Actually, I mean, a great example of the virtual model, quite frankly, is Chasey Partners. Well, we've been working for 15 years. We do not have physical office locations. We never have done. Everyone works from home or works from client locations. So we've been virtual for 15 years. We get asked about this definition between remote and virtual all the time. Everybody has their own definitions, and Paul really talked about this earlier on. But the important thing, as Emma said, is they're still attached to a physical location. So remote, generally speaking, is someone who works from home for a set number of days in a period, but will still go into a physical location periodically. So they may work 2 to 3 days at home and then go in for 2 or 3 days, or they may even work, a couple of weeks from home and then rotate 2 weeks. So it's that. So they're still attached to a physical location, whereas virtual, there's no physical location that they are associated with. So we've seen this. We just added this as a definitional help for the discussion on this slide.
Yep. Okay, so we're heading towards the bottom right-hand corner. Now that may depend on the size of the organization. We're not a massive organization. It's probably a bit different if you're a bank, for example. So then looking at the future of work, we've put in a few.
The only other comment I would add, Emma, on travel, and I know Paul and I discussed this just the other day. Travel has gone to zero for a lot of organizations for obvious reasons. But the challenge, I think, as we come out of the pandemic, is to what degree should you start traveling again? And my opinion on that, although we're discussing it, again, I had this conversation yesterday, is anything that requires that personal interaction will require travel again, be that team building from an internal perspective or account management, customer relationship from an external perspective. So we're going to see that travel start, but it won't be at the same level as before. That's my view on that.
Yeah, and there is a flip side, of course, with that the people that we would previously have traveled to meet may not be physically there where we expected to have them before. Yeah. So there's a few moving parts there. But if we come back to this, some of the things that we see linked, better the impact, whether it's high, low, medium on different structures. So looking at the traditional, the everybody physically in a central location. Good for standardization or more conducive to standardization, scalability, control, and labor arbitrage. Not so, the lesser impact on resilience, or not so good for resilience because of the dependence on a central site, and talent retention. We're calling that an average. So if we look at the hybrid remote and the virtual, you can see that the standardization, we're saying potential to be higher. But for virtual, it's probably maybe not so good. On scalability, average, but virtual is going to be more of a challenge. Okay. Same for control environment. The labor arbitrage, we said there's no change when we get to the hybrid, but a bit of a reduction when we get to virtual in terms of the impact. And resilience, probably around the other way. Resilience and also, interestingly enough, talent retention, because we're saying that the resilience is greater when we've got more virtual structure, less dependence on a central structure or a hub and spoke around that. And at least so far, we're seeing that in terms of talent retention, that's quite an attractive proposition. Now we have an acid test, because at this point we should be doing another poll, and as you know, we had some issues about that in a second. We'll try. If not, the question we like to ask is, which long-term strategy are you prioritizing to drive the future of work? And there's a choice here. I think you should basically click one. If you get the QR code, click one, and we'll gather the thoughts briefly, and then I'll ask the same question of Paul. I'm not sure if it's working. I can't see anything on my screen, so I'm presuming it's not working.
Sarah, okay, here you go.
There we go. So make your choice, please, people. And
for this time around, you don't need your cell phone, so you can do it directly, answering the questions in your screen.
Okay, so while that's happening, can I, Paul, say, which long-term strategy are you looking to prioritize for the future of work?
Well, I can talk about the space cost. I think that was mentioned earlier. It maybe falls under the increased adoption of remote working. I've had the privilege of being in charge of shared service center space in 3 jobs now. So that's a lot of fun for those of you who've ever done that. But currently, we were actually planning on adding space, or at least reconfiguring our space prior to COVID, because of the growth of our center. And since COVID came and we've been doing the hoteling and fewer days in the office for people, I wouldn't be surprised if we reduce space. We're certainly not going to increase space at this time. I remember talking to my counterparts or contacts in real estate when the pandemic first hit, and they all thought it was going to be a great boom to the real estate industry, because now everybody had to be 6 feet apart. And I said, I think you better hold on a little bit, because I'm not sure that's the case. And it's actually quite the opposite. I think we're going to have to look at space and making it more conducive to the type of work that we're now entering into. It's not everybody gets their own cubicle. Now maybe we have different types of space where you're collaborating in one, or you have heads down in the other. I think there's going to be a lot more creativity around that. And everybody I've talked to has told me that we're going to have some amount of remote work. So that's definitely my number one there.
Shara, can you show again the results? I think that you, Paul, and Emmer, you may want to talk a little bit about the results there.
This is really interesting. Because actually I would have said the same. I would have answered 3, because the remote working part is really important for sure. But let's move on, sort of, in a way, right? It's part of it. It's really about operating model, which includes talent, includes use of process and technology, which clearly links to the intelligent automation discussion we're about to have. So I would strongly support the bulk of the answers. Clearly, remote working is part of that. Intelligent automation is significant too. So I find that actually encouraging in my own thought process, that result. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Emma.
No, this is curious. It's interesting that people are talking about the model itself. That's a good thing. That it's a good depth of vision of what to do, and talking about how to deal with talent, how to make better use of technology, but thinking about how things are structured. That's a good thing for me.
Yeah.
And actually, if you group number 3 and 4, right, it's almost 80%. Of the respondents, they think that they need to change the operating model, and that includes the use of new technologies, which is 4, investing more in intelligent automation, RPA, machine learning.
Yeah, there is a question that came across about agility and from Fred. Thanks for asking the question. You know, we're actually going to, as always, we're probably going to run out of time here, but we're going to talk a little about agility as part of this, as a future state later on. But absolutely, organizations need to be agile and flexible. It's not about same people doing same things in same ways. Sort of linking back to the out of sight, out of mind comments, that agility is going to be fundamentally important, not just for shared services, but for operating models across the entire enterprise. So thanks, Fred.
Okay, I think as Phil mentioned there, in the interest of time, let's move on, because we're now going to talk about the digitally enabled service delivery model. And I'll hand over to Chewy.
Thank you, Emer. And as you probably know, right, it's not the first time you're going to hear that we're right in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution. And I think that what makes me think about how this fourth revolution is different to previous ones, it's the speed, right? So how fast can you integrate new technologies? How fast existing technologies are coming together? So to me, it is a revolution with the previous ones, but speed and how exponentially you can change operating models. How can you better manage data across the back office, middle office, and front office? I think that that's what it's a game changer in this fourth revolution. And from an RPA perspective and automation perspective as well, I think that a trend that we're seeing in recent surveys is that both decision makers and middle management, the operation teams, they are seeing the benefits now. So it's not about whether I want to start or launch an automation RPA program. Automation is here, right? And adoption is increasing. And back to my comment on the fourth revolution, it's accelerating. So as you can see here, 92% of the decision makers, they think RPA is important. But also from an employee perspective, more and more employees are embracing the idea of automation. They're getting used to work side by side with bots. And even in this context of post-COVID digitalization, the idea of having hybrid workforce is not hybrid from just who goes to the office and who stays remote, but also hybrid from the fact that bots and humans are interacting today in shared service centers in how things are processed and how processes are executed. I always try to go back to the basics, right? So even though automation is accelerating, you don't want to go crazy, right? So something that is very important is to really pick the right processes that you want to automate, keeping in mind the structure of the data, keeping in mind that you want to automate processes and systems that are stable, that you want to focus on those that are highly manual, but also they have high volumes. So picking the right processes is critical to launch a project, but it's also critical to continue to grow existing automation programs. Hyperautomation, right? So what is hyperautomation and what is not hyperautomation? So hyperautomation, it's not just RPA growing and growing in more capabilities. It's actually the mix of existing technologies. So technologies that have been out there for a long time, like machine learning, like BPMS, like artificial intelligence, they're coming together, right? So this idea of the fourth revolution, where you are accelerating the use of technologies, is also how these technologies are coming together, right? So how do you scale your automation program? It's when you bring machine learning, optical recognition, intelligent document processing capabilities into the existing, right? So it's using your existing base of automation and adding a layer of intelligent automation, adding a layer of artificial intelligence, and then being able to reach out, right, as a shared service center, to reach out to new processes that in the past you could not automate, but also very important, how do you reach out as a shared service center to other audiences, other constituencies, even outside of the GBS center or the shared service center. So following this idea, what we're seeing as a trend is that shared service centers and GBS centers are becoming more and more launch platforms for automation. Think about it this way, right? shared service centers became naturally, right? Even prior to COVID, became naturally big consumers of automation. So due to the nature of transactional processes being based in the centers, they became consumers, natural consumers. As good consumers, they learned. They learned what works and what doesn't work, right? So they became almost learners throughout the process, very natural evolutions. And as shared service centers are becoming more and more automated, other organizations outside of the centers, when they look at the centers, they're asking about RPA. They're even asking help from an automation standpoint. So more and more we're seeing that shared service centers are creating centers of excellence for automating within the center and automating outside the center. And why COEs are important? Because COEs are your governed body that are going to allow you to accelerate automation. Why? Because you are going to be able to create a structure, you are going to be able to create a policy, you are going to be able to create the frameworks from a technical perspective and from a process perspective to accelerate discovery, to improve and standardize how you develop bots, but also how you manage bots. Being able to become that launch platform, that is going to engage with employees, so employees buy in the idea of automation, and they also create a new way to send ideas to the center, right? So how do you engage more and more employees, more and more organizations, so they become first interested in automation, but they feel that they want to send new ideas and they want to explore new processes to automate. And last but not least, right, a center of excellence needs to measure, needs to provide visibility to the business about processes that are being automated, how bots are operating in production, real qualitative and quantitative benefits in new dashboards, right? And going back to hyperautomation, adding this business intelligence and advanced analytic layer to automation gives you a different way to identify opportunities for future automations in the existing organizations in the center and outside of the center. Just a definition, Chase's definition on what is a center of excellence. It's a central governed body, right? Helps to run automations and projects across the organization. It's not about technology. Let's keep in mind that RPA and hyperautomation, it's not about only technology. It's about people, how you train individuals, how do you create the right structures, how do you engage the organization from a process perspective, how do you create the right client interaction framework, so your center of excellence for automation, it's not an isolated entity trying to automate, technical guys trying to automate something out there, but rather a business partner that is going to help process owners to identify opportunities to grow existing automations and to bring new technologies, right? Like machine learning, intelligent document processing, to create faster, to create more complex automations in the long run. And what we always say, right? Do you need a COE in your shared service centers to start an RPA program? You probably don't. You probably don't need a center of excellence to launch a program. But if you want to scale, if you want to grow, if you want to move towards hyperautomation, COE is a must.
Hey, Chewy, we had a question come across as you move on to here, so I was just going to quickly ask you.
Sure. Thank you.
The question is from Bob, and he says, how do you see blockchain impacting on a shared services GBS, specifically vendor-client connectivity and automation of the single source of the truth? So I know, Chewy, you and I have done some presentations on blockchain and the potential relevance from shared services in GBS, but you want to have a go answer to that, and I can add some comments as well.
Sure. It's relevant. It's relevant. So think about it this way, right? First, think about it. What is blockchain? It's how do you connect with external entities? How do you create rules of engagement, right? To deal with external entities and to transact in a secure way with those external entities, suppliers and clients, right? And what is automation? Automation is how do you transact internally and how do you run transactions throughout your system. So if you add the capabilities of a blockchain, which is your connection to the external, with the capacities of automation, you can have, in some ways, a hyper-connected way of operating, where you are automating your order to cash or your procure to pay, and that's what you connect transactionally and safely, right, with the external vendors and the external clients.
So yeah, I would just add that, of course, blockchain is effectively a distributed ledgers. So as you talk about this sort of vendor-client connectivity, yes, and it's actually, in a way, it's a significant extension of self-service. So you're actually effectively working together. But what you do need is trust in the data and the tools being used, and very clear policy. So your comment about single source of the truth is also important, because if you move to a distributed ledger environment, you need to trust that distributed ledger environment and the access and privacy rules around that. But so the answer is it's coming. The question is how soon is it's coming is another question around blockchain, which we've been asked. We're not too. It's not actually been as pervasive yet. But often technologies aren't, and they suddenly are. But it will likely be part of the hyper automation trends that Chewy's been referring to. So thanks for the question, Bob. Sorry, Chewy, back to you.
Well, just following the line of thoughts about centers of excellence out of your shared service center, right? There are different models, right? And you probably heard this before. It's your central. This is the preferred model from an IT perspective. You keep the controlling one single entity. You get higher expertise. You're able to really consolidate from a software perspective in the buying power. What is the disadvantages of a centralized model is that, always priorities, right? Where my priority goes as a process owner, if this is central in IT. Federated is practically decentralized. So each business unit, each shared service center running their own automations. It is faster. There's no doubt about it, right? But there's inconsistency about the use of technology, about best practices for development, about best practices for managing and controlling bots in production. And then there's this third one that is hybrid or core federated, which is you have a central governed body, incorporate normally, and then you have satellite COEs that from an automation standpoint provide services to a number of organizations. For example, we're seeing a trend where CFOs are asking for the creation of center of excellence just for finance. And that center of excellence for finance provides services to the shared service centers, but also to finance organizations that are not yet centralized in shared service centers. And this provides agility, right? So you create some form of an expertise from a finance process perspective, but also with the automation focus. So this combination of the process expertise with the technology, it's something that we're seeing. So from these three models, probably the hybrid one, it's the one that we see growing. We've been seeing growing over the last 18 months.
Yeah, we have a raft. Chewy, we have a raft of questions coming through, which is fantastic. If any we don't get to on this call, we will follow up with you. I mean, a couple of just so Muniera, your question on how do you kick off a greenfield technology where there's no legacy systems and a proof of concept. So if you can contact us afterwards, we can absolutely go back to you. How to use intelligent automation and robotics to set up a technology solution where there are no legacy systems in a greenfield healthcare. It's a great question. We probably don't have time to answer that now. If you could send us that afterwards. There's a question from Kevin about RPA and specifically Power Automate from Microsoft and citizen development and less, which is distributed development. It's a great point, but we'll come back to you on that. But he's really asking about the governance model around that, where that distributed citizen-led development, Chewy. So that's the question there. And then a question from Jeff is primary concern about moving forward with true engagement of employees when there's limited face-to-face interaction. So we'll follow up with these questions. I don't know if you had any comments. There are some others coming through as well as even as I'm speaking, but I don't know if you had any particular comment on the Power Automate solution from Microsoft, Chewy, specifically, because that one is around citizen development and distributing. So how would you govern that? Maybe just take that one.
As you guys probably know, last year Microsoft made a big acquisition. They acquired Softomotive, which is one of the oldest RPA platforms in the world. They integrated the Softomotive software in the Power Platform. And from being, how quadrants work, right? Gartner and Everest and so forth. Microsoft is coming, right? It's coming. They're making a number of investments. We still see UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and Blue Prism as the leaders, but Softomotive and the Power Platform they're getting there, right? And from a citizen development perspective, which is something that you know, in this chart we're calling out, right? We're calling out blockchain to watch, and we're calling citizen development to watch. It is a trend, yeah. How do you get to the right balance, right? Giving away automation capabilities to any user can be very powerful from an ability to automate more and more. How do you control that? Back to my comment, right? It's a center of excellence, right? So the center of excellence needs to be responsible for the policy, for the structure, selection of technology, and controlling the technology. So even though you may think about citizen development as a distributed model where everybody's doing what they want to do, you need to have a technology on the top, a layer on the top that is going to monitor the activity of citizen developers from a development perspective, but also from a running bots in production perspective. So it goes back to a control layer that with citizen development or without citizen development becomes that central governed body that provides the control and the visibility. And the polling question. So the polling question is coming up. Be patient. So this is all about technology. This is all about central governed bodies. There's a lot of questions and interest in citizen development. How do I control it? So we thought about this as a very interesting question. Who is responsible for launching? And think about your own enterprise, your own company. Who is responsible in your company for launching, managing, scaling your RPA intelligent automation programs for shared service centers and GBS? We'll appreciate your responses. So Paul, while we wait for the results, from your perspective, right, where do you see it now and where do you see it going, right? This governance, ownership, I know that is a very controversial thing, right? Yeah. Many think IT owns it, many think IT should not own it, but you know, how do you see it? How do you feel about it?
Well, let me talk a little bit about my experience at Becton Dickinson. I was there back in 2016 when we kicked off the program there. And I remember hearing all about RPA. It was all the rage about how easy it is and how it's going to change the world. And the truth is that it takes about an afternoon or maybe one day to create a bot. But getting your organization ready and having the governance in place and making sure all of the parts of IT and all the parts of the business and all the process owners and GBS work together, that can take months. And that's where you need a center of excellence. And at Becton Dickinson, we had the centralized model on your slide earlier, where there was a center in Kuala Lumpur, a manager with some resources. And then we had a separate resource in each one of the 4 regional centers who worked with the process owners. But it was a partnership with IT, and it was a partnership with other parts of the business and other parts of the infrastructure. You would be surprised what comes into play when you talk about RPA. One of the aspects that always interested me is a lot of times you give bots an ID. You give them like a badge, like they're a person. We talk about them like they're people, and there are implications for that in terms of who can perform what processes and does security get involved then? And is it just cybersecurity or is it some other kind of security? So there's a lot of players in here that you don't think about. And so I think creating a COE is not only necessary if you want to scale, but it's almost necessary just to kick off. In my current role, we've done a couple pilots with RPA, and they've been successful, but we've not really gone down the road of the COE. So I've seen both models, and you can make it work. It depends upon what your target and what you're what you're wanting to do. Becton Dickinson had 100 bots in production and 100 under development when I left a couple of years later. So they were really on a tear with this thing, and I think the COE was definitely necessary.
It is interesting, just quickly with this polling result, it's 38% center of excellence within SSC GBS and 33% hybrid between IT and shared services. I mean, that's probably what I maybe would have expected, but it is interesting that shared service GBS actually won that little battle there, that little polling result there. But I would say that whatever you do, clearly you have to work with IT because of integration with IT and infrastructure and security and access, and IT would for sure should be involved. But to Chewy's point, you can start these programs without necessarily, you could do it, you don't need a COE to start, but once you do, you need to put a governance structure in place, whatever that governance structure may or may not be. So thanks, Paul, appreciate that. I know we're sort of running out of time here, given some of the technical issues at the start. So we actually will probably run over. One of the advantages of running your own webinars is that we don't have another event coming straight after this one that we have to close out. So if you guys need to leave at the end of the hour, we completely understand, of course, because of the time, but we will just overrun a little bit and stay on to finish. So if you can stay on, great. If you can't, well, thank you very much for attending. I appreciated that. We do have some questions coming through, and some additional questions. And as I said, we will follow up with those questions as we get through. So as we just we start to close out. I mean, we've got some summary on here on what next generation shared services, and there was a comment earlier on about agility, and we've got it right here in the middle. So as we move forward, there are a number of things we just captured on this one slide. On the right hand side, we talked about digitalization and automation as being, fundamentally important to not just shared services next generation, but to enterprise value and growth and development and competitive advantage, quite frankly. We talked about operating model, as being a resilient operating model. And that's where you start to get into, working structures and reporting lines and how things are, how you develop end-to-end processes truly, and how you have COEs, etc. Number 3 is strategic partner on the right. I mean, again, it's not out of sight and out of mind anymore. GBS shared services is part of the fundamental competitive value from an organization. Some organizations we're talking to is actually what are the levers you can pull, both to use your data and provide support to the business, but also what levers do you have to improve your margins, right? Well, back office, both from a cost perspective and from a value perspective in helping you make the right decisions efficiently, is a huge driver for margin improvement across that. So, and be a strategic business partner and enable that business partnering. Number 4 is enhanced performance and capabilities, which links to, as Emil was saying, around the service partnership agreement and continuous improvement and measures and metrics and a client interaction framework. Those are all fundamental. And on the left-hand side, it's, it's not about function anymore. It's about service as a service. We've talked about organization a lot. We've talked a lot about technology. I've mentioned agility. Capability is critical, not only within the structure of your operating model, but who you leverage as external partners and your skills within your own team, linking to that strategic, the vision of the company, the mission of the company. We talked about globalization. I mean, while there has been, as mentioned, some onshoring of nearshoring back of resources associated with the pandemic and some concerns over supply chain, we're still global. We're going to be global. We are global. We're going to continue to be global. In fact, in the outsourcing space, just to link back to a comment earlier on, we're seeing the outsourcers focusing more on value services around technology and RPA and maybe even SI work, less about the old accounts payable and bank reconciliation, etc. That stuff, the processes within finance and HR are more coming back onshore, but there's still these centers of expertise or centers of skills, I should say, and expertise being provided by outsourcers, and that's how they're redeveloping. So you need to link to that model properly and the future of what we've talked about. So those are some of the main trends. Obviously, take a look at that. Where do we start? This is the final slide, but if we have any, we can stay on for extra questions. But where do we start? One, don't forget, you have to get the basics right. You have to still close the books. You have to still pay people. You have to still have hiring processes in place. You have to still you'll be able to procure services. You have to be able to pay for those services. So the basics are still fundamentally important. What you're trying to do is make that as seamless and efficient as possible. So don't forget that. So we're still talking about robust operating model, effective client interaction framework, and business continuity plans. Number two, take the time to think about your current state and develop a business case. Business cases are fundamental, right? I could go on about projects I've been involved for the last 25, 30 years where business cases have been not considered important enough because, oh, we've made the decision, let's just go. And then later on, you've spent, forever doing a business case and you've got a cupboard full of multiple business cases. You never did anything because you spent too much time assessing it. But they are fundamental and you need to evolve those business cases as well. Expanding scope and moving up the value chain. So that's been around for years. That's into professional and technical, like we talked about, cross-regional, into the middle office and closer to the front office around the one office concept. We've talked about digital automation. We've talked about centers of excellence and automation capabilities. The future of work, we've discussed a lot. So work out, just think about how that's relevant for your organization and your team and how it supports your mission. Skill sets, right? So, one of the things that probably been undervalued in GBS and shared services is quite making sure you have the right role descriptions and skill sets and training. That really needs an emphasis. People development, that's been underemphasized, quite frankly, especially in traditional shared services. That needs to be, re-energized going forward. I've talked about capabilities as a service and service model as opposed to sort of process. It's more about service, and embrace the one office concept that we talked about earlier on, and master data standards and trusted information. We talked about a single version of the truth earlier on in answer to one of the questions. And how do you fill the gap? If data is all over the place and captured, how do you bring that together and value it? And how do you know that data is right? How do you know it's consistent? How do you know it's going to give you the information you need? And finally, number 10, before I ask Paul for his comments on next generation, where he sees this going. If you don't do something differently, then what's the point? You have to think differently. So think about what you need to change. Think about how you need to adapt. That's the whole point. That's what change is about. And managing change is not about just being the lowest point of resistance. In other words, change management requires managing a change. If you change nothing, you don't need change management. So with that, Paul, your thoughts on next generation before we close out?
I just want to say that here in my current role, we're already looking at hyperautomation. This is, I think of hyperautomation as looking at RPA as a tool, but realizing that it's one tool in the tool shed. And Chewy had a great slide earlier that listed a lot of other technologies, process mining, digitization, just a number of things. I mean, we've all got companies that have legacy systems, right? Unless you're a brand new startup. And the idea is to take a look at those and get them transformed as quickly as possible. And if GBS can be seen as the engine for that, as the people that know how to make those changes, that's where I think we can do things differently and move up the chain from those being the transaction guys to being the people that are really leading the transformations.
Thanks, Paul. So we've just run over a couple of minutes. Apologies about the technical issues earlier on, which I think only took a couple of minutes. So I think we made that up. So thank you very much, Paul, for your attendance today. It's great to get your insights and contribution. Thanks, Chewy, on the hyperautomation. Thanks, Emer, for the trends. And thanks for everybody attending today and your list of questions, many of which we haven't yet had a chance to answer, but we will come back to everyone who's asked a question. So thank you for your attendance and hope you have a great rest of the day. Appreciate your attendance. Bye-bye.
Thank you.